Good morning, everyone, for joining for this webinar. Hope everyone is doing safe and fine. I would like to first of all thank you all for taking out the time and joining for this webinar. Few housekeeping rules before we start. So this webinar is going to be recorded, and a recording will be shared with everyone, and it's also going to be available on DigitalOcean YouTube platform. So do not worry in case you miss this webinar or you have to jump in between. You will not miss it. If you have any questions or queries regarding the session, we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. So just type in your queries in the chat window and we will be taking them towards the end of the session. So with that note, I think we will start and yes. So the session theme for today is all around Kubernetes. So I'm sure most of you must be aware of Kubernetes, right? So what I'm going to talk about is Kubernetes really a silver bullet? Can it solve all your infrastructure issues and problems? So basically, we will be talking about what are the best cases where Kubernetes is an effective solution or a tool. And there might be certain cases where you can avoid a tool like Kubernetes. So let's start this session. So that's a brief introduction about me. I'm Saurabh. I'm a senior developer advocate with DigitalOcean. I have nearly more than a decade of experience working mostly around cloud technologies, DevOps. Last couple of years has been mostly around container technologies and Kubernetes, right? I have experience working with a lot of startups in the past. I'm based out of India. So that's all about me, and let's start this session. So the agenda for today is Kubernetes and its benefits. So why Kubernetes as a technology is so popular? Definitely, what are the benefits, right? We will be talking about some Kubernetes success stories from the ecosystem. And then we will come to our main theme. What are the use cases where Kubernetes could be a good solution for you when you should use Kubernetes? Secondly, what are the options where you can skip out of Kubernetes as a technology? In the end, we will have basically a recap of the summary, and we will be taking Q&A, right? So without any further delay, let me jump into the session and let me start. So basically, yes, this is what is the theme for the day, to be or not to be with Kubernetes. So are you planning to use container and Kubernetes within your organization, or you're already at a level where you are kind of past the exploratory phase and trying to implement, be it your dev, staging, or production environment? So yes. What I've done is I've kind of divided this theme into two parts. First, where I'm talking about what are the benefits and what are the use cases where Kubernetes is a good solution. So this is part one. And part two would be where are the possible solutions where you can skip a system like Kubernetes. So that will be the second part of the theme. So what does Kubernetes actually do and why it is used? What are the benefits of it? So before we start directly with Kubernetes and its benefits, let's see how things are faring on the ecosystem side in terms of Kubernetes adoption, right? And before that, why do a system like Kubernetes is required? So first of all, when we do production deployments, right? So we know production deployments are definitely a big task. Things do fail in production. It doesn't work as always planned. Things do break in production, especially with adoption of technologies like container, right? Especially Docker. And when you start scaling, you have a lot of containers to manage in production and things start breaking. How do you deal with those kind of issues? So definitely, yes, this is a typical scenario which we have seen many times, right? Production deployment can go wrong. You deploy a certain code or a certain backend application and things start breaking in the production. And that is where solutions like Kubernetes comes in handy because it has a lot of inbuilt features that can save you beforehand from these kind of issues in the production. So a quick glance at Kubernetes adoption trends globally. How Kubernetes is faring as compared to other technologies, other container orchestrator platforms. These are not the latest 2020 data, maybe around a bit old. around 2019 or 2018, but then still they are relevant for our use cases. So if you see in terms of adoption, right, around 69% of organizations have their workloads being managed by Kubernetes kind of system. So approximately 70% of organizations use Kubernetes internally to manage their workloads. So that is a high number. Number of containers in production. So if you just see the graphs, they depict different years from 2016 to 2019. And you can see the number of containers in terms of like less than 50, and then the last one being greater than 5,000 containers. So if you see the last graph, we see more than 5,000, right? For 2019, that has risen from 15% last time to 19% this year. So definitely that graph is increasing in terms of number of containers being deployed into production year over year, which significantly shows how popular the container technology is and how the adoption of Kubernetes is being done by the ecosystem. So this was a data from DZone, I think somewhere around 2018. They did a poll from within the community to check what container orchestrator platform is being used. And around 40% of the respondents, they said they were using Kubernetes, or they were at least exploring to use Kubernetes. And yeah, the final one, this is like a 2019 data by Datadog. It's a monitoring solution, right? So Kubernetes share among organizations, that's again kind of increasing. If you see the typical graph, there's a rising peak over there year on year, which means basically the community, the software community globally is going for Kubernetes as a killer tool and definitely sees a lot of benefit out of it. So that's a kind of typical adoption trend that we see globally. But the point is, you as an organization, do you have that requirement or use case to jump in for Kubernetes kind of solution? If yes, what are those requirements? If no, can you bypass Kubernetes? So we will see those things in detail now, right? So when we see a great adoption by a technology within the community, definitely means it comes with a lot of benefits. That's why a lot of people are trying to go for that technology and adopt it. And not only Kubernetes, the Kubernetes ecosystem itself, right? A lot of tools are being built around Kubernetes to support that, be it monitoring solutions or network solutions, ingress controllers, those kind of things. So the entire ecosystem is expanding. Definitely has a great future, but let's see what are the benefits at a high level. So why do people prefer Kubernetes, right? So some of the quick benefits are, it's a self-healing system. We saw in the first few slides, right? Things can go wrong in production and deployment can break. The deployment can go wrong, things can break in production. So Kubernetes as a tool comes with self-healing capabilities. What does that mean is you have a kind of a master and node setup. Master keeps on checking the nodes, and in case find a node unhealthy, it deletes that node and bring up a new node with the same capabilities and deploy, right? So you do not need a dedicated person to monitor your setup. Kubernetes is doing it automatically for you. So that's basically the self-healing capabilities of a Kubernetes system. Workload scalability. So it's kind of auto-scaling features that are a part of Kubernetes. You can, Kubernetes has configuration files, which are kind of YAML files. You can define the min and the max number of nodes that you want. So in case I want that, in case of high peak traffic, I want X plus, whatever number of nodes I'm running, I want to scale them to 2x or 3x. I can do that and define that number within the file. So whenever I have a peak, automatically for me, the architecture will scale up. And whenever the peak subsides, it will bring back to the original number. So that's a kind of auto-scaling functionality that is inbuilt and comes as a part of the package with Kubernetes. So which definitely helps organizations which are kind of having issues with scaling. High availability, so definitely provides you out of the box a highly available solution. As I said, the master keeps on checking the health of the worker nodes. As and when it finds something unhealthy, it replaces that with a healthy worker node. So there is always availability of worker nodes which are in a best possible sync. In case there is a delay or if there is an issue within the cluster, right, the master can take care of it. Definitely you have to define those as a part of the policies within your configuration file, but then that is a part of the package with Kubernetes. You can do automatic rollouts and rollbacks. So that is another functionality which is quite popular and makes Kubernetes a favorite of the ecosystem. So Kubernetes has capabilities to manage your secrets and configuration management, right? So again, a part of the configuration, you can define secrets within YAML files and manage, and Kubernetes will take care of it. Easy deployment. So in case of having a system like Kubernetes, makes your deployment cycle much more easier and faster. So you can go for faster deployment cycles in much lesser time. Monitoring and health checks. So yes, it does come with a inbuilt monitoring and health check system and updates you about any issues beforehand. It's a portable solution. So this is another great USP of Kubernetes as a solution, right? As a tool. It's quite portable, and that is kind of derived from the underlying technology, which is basically Docker. So Kubernetes is basically using Docker as an underlying tool under the hood. So what does that mean is you can run a Kubernetes kind of a solution on any platform, any OS, and also on any cloud. So it's also cloud agnostic. Until and unless you are using a cloud managed Kubernetes offering, you are not dependent on any cloud provider. You can have your own self-managed vanilla Kubernetes, and you can host it on any cloud provider or even on your VMs, right? Or your local machines. So definitely being cloud agnostic and a portable solution adds to the flexibility. You are never a kind of a vendor lock-in with any kind of cloud vendor. You can always move out and decide to go with the other vendor, basically on certain maybe benefits, right? They are offering, or you can also plan to run it on your own. So talking about the benefits, now we would like to see who all are using Kubernetes in the ecosystem, and maybe also try to understand why they implemented in terms of the success stories, right? So this is a section that I've tried to get directly from Kubernetes.io. That's a document. If you just see this link, right, it has a section for case studies. So just try to gather some case studies for you. So just a couple of case studies over there, not trying to cover all. So Bose, the well-known audio house, right? They were having issues with the infrastructure setup, and as and when they were trying to scale, they were facing challenges over there. So I think they implemented Kubernetes kind of an approach within the DevOps team. And what was the high-level impact or outcome of that approach was, you can see, right, with about 100 engineers onboarded, the platform enables now 30,000 plus non-production deployments across dozens of microservices. So basically, they were having microservice architecture, but finding it difficult to manage the deployments across the platform. Now with the help of Kubernetes, that's pretty easy. So that's a well-known brand name over there, right? Similarly, Nokia also uses or has been using Kubernetes for their infrastructure setup. So the impact of using Kubernetes was Kubernetes has enabled Nokia's foray into 5G technology. They've internally set up Kubernetes to manage their workloads on containers, and it has really helped their DevOps or the cloud team. A similar kind of success story, again shared by another popular name over there, right? Amadeus. So they are basically into your airline ticketing system, the biggest one over there. So Amadeus Airline implemented Kubernetes, which manages ever-increasing flight search volume. It's now handling production level transactions, which are like thousands of transactions per second, and it's deployed multiple data centers across the world. So these are certain success stories, and in case you want to know more what other companies from the ecosystem or big players from the ecosystem are using Kubernetes, you can definitely try this link, kubernetes.io/case studies. That's the way to go. We'll have many more case studies over there. But in general, right now, the kind of picture that we have is Kubernetes as a tool is quite popular in the industry. A lot of people are using Kubernetes and driving benefits out of it. We have seen what kind of benefits come as a part of the Kubernetes toolchain, be it auto-scaling, self-healing, or avoiding vendor lock-in cloud platform thing, being cloud agnostic, right? And then we also see some success stories of people who have been using Kubernetes and the kind of solutions they have used to avoid delayed deployments and managing the infrastructure. So big names over there. So till now, if I'm new to Kubernetes, I would be definitely overwhelmed and definitely think that this is a technology which is going to change the world, right? So definitely yes, it's a new technology. It's going to be a future technology. Everyone is going mad for containers. They're trying to implement containers as and when they scale. They have a lot of containers or Docker images to manage. That's where Kubernetes kind of solutions step in and plays an important role in managing your infrastructure, be it scaling, auto healing, and those kind of benefits, right? So everything looks pretty rosy till here, all good. But definitely, I think, as we say, right, life is not fair. So each coin has two sides to it. So definitely there would be certain shortcomings or drawbacks on Kubernetes. Or is it like everyone now in the technical world needs to implement Kubernetes? Is it like that? So after seeing the benefits, let's talk about certain other things in detail. Let's see the next part. So I think we are kind of done with the first part where we talked about benefits and use cases for Kubernetes, right? And I'm kind of midway for my session, but I feel that no one should have or no one should resonate with this kind of a feeling. Right? What is going on and I don't understand. So we are basically talking about Kubernetes as a technology. And till now we have seen why you should implement Kubernetes. We have seen the adoption trends across the world. We have seen what are the benefits Kubernetes can give to your infrastructure setup. Definitely a lot of other big players around the globe have implemented Kubernetes, and this has been a successful exercise for them. So that's the first part. The second part comes with, when can I skip Kubernetes, or alternately, should I implement Kubernetes? Is it like the need of the hour and I should also implement them? Because everyone around me is talking about Kubernetes, containers, those kind of technologies, right? And I feel missed out. So I think that's more of a FOMO factor that we call, right, the fear of missing out on a technology. So there are certain scenarios which I think are kind of skeptical for Kubernetes kind of approach, where you can avoid Kubernetes. So that would be the part 2, and let me start with that. Right, so Kubernetes is not for faint-hearted. So that's kind of a disclaimer. And why do I say so? We will see in next few slides over the time. Just to give you an idea, Kubernetes is a new technology, has been there for nearly like, let's say 5 years now, have matured a lot over the years, definitely since its inception, have been widely adopted by the community. But then definitely one point for being sure is Kubernetes is a complex technology, especially if you're trying to do a self-managed Kubernetes kind of a setup, which is like out of the box vanilla Kubernetes. You're doing it on your own. It's a complex technology. So that is one part, but there might be other things to it. So just keep this in mind, right? So Kubernetes is not for faint-hearted. You need a strong heart to implement something like Kubernetes within your organization or within your team. So when I started Kubernetes, this was the kind of reaction that I had, right? I was kind of fully confused. I knew cloud. I have been working with majority of cloud providers, most of the public cloud providers. I have worked with them. But Kubernetes was relatively new and was a different ballgame altogether, right? So a lot of new terms. So if you see something like pods, kubectl, etcd, nodes, node affinity, then ecosystem, right? Prometheus, Istio, scheduler, replica set, ingress. What is all this? A lot of new terminologies coming at, like being thrown at you, and you are like wondering, am I doing the right thing, or is it like, should I do it or shouldn't I? So we have seen why should you do it. Now we are trying to explore the second phase, which is like, shouldn't I or can I skip Kubernetes? The first, the slide before this one, we saw Kubernetes is a complex system, right? It's not for faint-hearted, and it's kind of confusing because relatively a lot of new terms and concepts are there which you need to understand before you go on like a real-time implementation of Kubernetes ecosystem. So basically, what are the challenges that come along with Kubernetes adoption? We saw that people are widely accepting Kubernetes, getting a lot of love from the community. But as I said, right, there's always two sides to a coin. It cannot be all rosy all along. So there are certain challenges which comes as a part of Kubernetes adoption and depends upon what kind of bucket you belong to. So are you a part of the first bucket for whom Kubernetes is a good trend to adopt, or you are part of the second bucket, this bucket that we're going to check, and you can skip Kubernetes for now, maybe give it a thought later on. So let's see what are certain challenges over there, right? So basically, as I mentioned, Kubernetes is a complex technology to implement, comes with a lot of new features, functionalities that you need to understand. And basically, you have to start with the basic concepts of container and Docker, because Docker is underlying for technology for Kubernetes, right? So to have understanding of Kubernetes, you need to understand how containers work, the way they network, what are the kind of networking technologies available for Docker and other containers. And then you can start diving into a Kubernetes kind of ecosystem. So that's a complex thing, no issues, I agree. There are a lot of technology. This is not the first technology in the market which is kind of complex. There have been complex technologies in the past, right? But then people adopted and they have become quite popular and given good results over complex years. The next one is Kubernetes comes with a steep learning curve. So not only this technology is complex, but also has its own learning curve. And as I said, because you need to understand things like container, how does Docker work, how does the internal networking work, those kind of concepts. So you definitely have a steep learning curve for someone who is new to this world. So someone who is not from like a DevOps world, who is new to cloud, who is new to Docker, or you are an organization who has yet not Dockerized your applications, right? You're still in an exploratory phase, whether we should Dockerize or we should not, whether we should go with a microservices kind of thing or we should not. Then definitely keep in mind that Kubernetes comes with a lot of learning curve and is a complex technology to get involved with. Kubernetes is expensive for small solutions. So in case you're not a big enterprise level kind of a setup, you are a startup or you are an individual trying to play around with Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes is kind of a expensive tool. And when I say expensive, it's not in terms of like the pricing that I'm talking about, because if you go for a vanilla Kubernetes, it's an open source project, it's free. Expensive here, I'm referring to in terms of the time and the resources that you put along, right? So is it really worth putting that kind of an effort for a Kubernetes kind of a solution? That's a kind of a use case. So not more from a pricing perspective, but this is more from efforts in terms of human resources and man hours that you put. So it's a complex tool. You need a lot of learning, and you have to like give a lot of time to your team or individuals to pick up Kubernetes technology, understand it, play around with it, and then finally implement once they gain some confidence. So do you have that kind of a bandwidth at hand? If you're a small startup, right, your focus area should be how to get your product to go to markets, right? You will be least bothered about whether it's being managed by Kubernetes or someone else. So for you, every technology is good till the time your production is up and running. You do not give a thought to Kubernetes or Docker. Your main area of concern is basically getting your products out to the market in the right time, as early as possible. So that's why I use that word expensive. Kubernetes works best in a microservices or containerized environment, right? So in case we are not having a microservices based architecture, you're not having Docker at your base for your applications, Kubernetes doesn't make sense. Reason being quite simple. Kubernetes is basically a container orchestrator. Until and unless you have containers as your base technology for your applications, you cannot need a something like Kubernetes to manage them, right? You do not use containers, you do not need anything to manage them. So in case you are planning to go with a microservices architecture, or you are still in a phase where we are implementing microservices, you can put or hold on Kubernetes kind of an architecture. Implement microservices, like maybe you are coming from a monolithic background, break the monolithic into microservices, get them containerized, and then see the kind of scale that you need to reach. And once you start feeling that I have reached a scale with containers that I cannot manage within my team, maybe Kubernetes could be an option to consider, but not immediately. Okay, so next one is Kubernetes might reduce productivity. That's at a high level. So definitely when we talked about benefits, right? So with the kind of benefits Kubernetes comes along with, it's supposed to increase the productivity of the team, which it does in the long run. But when I say it reduces productivity is when you do not have desired expertise within the team. So if you have a small team, you do not have dedicated cloud or DevOps experts who have kind of expertise in building containerized applications, then definitely Kubernetes is a tough task for you. So instead of immediately giving you out of the box like high productivity and performance, it will take some time, right? Toll on the team. So that's why we talked about complexity and learning curve. So initially you might see a dip in the productivity, but in the longer run, once you successfully have your applications and your entire production workload on Kubernetes, you will see the benefits. The transition to Kubernetes can be cumbersome, so definitely that's a typical use case. It's a complex technology when you do not have in-house expertise. This could be really time consuming and maybe not be the best solution that you would like to acquire at that point of time based on what is your use case. You have already reached a level that you have a lot of applications, microservices running in your system. You have different environments, be it staging or production, and you have a lot of containers and you feel miserable to manage those containers, right? So that point of time, you might consider something like Kubernetes, but you are a small scale shop, dev shop, and you have few containers to run, which can be easily managed by the team that you have. Maybe that's not a right time to consider something like as big as Kubernetes. We know, right? I mentioned that Kubernetes has been around like around 5 to 6 years. So it's a relatively new technology, which is quite popular in the market. But of late, what we have started seeing is Kubernetes also has security flaws. So we have seen certain vulnerabilities within the Kubernetes and also the ecosystem that it supports. So when I talk about Kubernetes, I also talk about Docker, which is kind of vulnerable. We have found vulnerabilities in Docker. Kubernetes uses supports basically Istio, which is an ingress controller. So Istio also has been found with some vulnerabilities in 2019. I mean, though those vulnerabilities have been patched in the latest versions, but still we cannot be sure or maybe 100% sure that Kubernetes is a secure, fully secure solution. So out of the box, Kubernetes might not be a completely secure solution. Maybe it's much more secure when you're using a managed Kubernetes offering by one of the cloud providers, because in that case, the security might be an added feature that the provider is giving to you on top of Kubernetes. But if you're using a vanilla self-hosted Kubernetes, it's definitely like not the best secured solution out there in the market. So you have to keep that in mind when you're trying to explore or trying to implement Kubernetes within your organization. Last but not the least, as we saw that in terms of adoption and trend, right, everyone is trying to implement Kubernetes because that's the most popular hotcake in the market. Everyone trying to get a piece of that. And why should I miss out? So even I'm trying to get into a Kubernetes kind of a setup. So do not go to the Kubernetes bandwagon because it's popular and everyone is doing it. Just for the sake of implementing Kubernetes, do not go for this kind of a tool or solution. So those are certain challenges that I wanted to highlight with a Kubernetes approach, right? So Kubernetes as a technology is good for certain use cases, but in case you do not meet those requirements, maybe it could be a good idea to skip Kubernetes for some time. If you're looking more from a learning perspective, you do not have bandwidth or expertise within your team, you can skip. In case you are a small shop or an individual not trying to like heavily scale in terms of containers and technologies, maybe you can skip. We know it requires or best work in a microservices architecture, right? So in case you do not have a microservices architecture, you're planning to do that, maybe Kubernetes is something that you can avoid at this point of time. From a security perspective, right, if you're looking for a very robust secure solution, Kubernetes is definitely not most flawless tool available right now in the market. There are certain vulnerabilities, as I said, which have been identified. There still might be more which are yet to be identified. So not a completely secure solution. So those are certain challenges. Let's try to kind of summarize them, right? So time for a quick recap that we have talked over, I think, last half an hour. Don't want to stretch it for too long. Just wanted to share my updates and inputs, what I've seen as the best practices, talking to like my customers and clients, in terms of adoption, right? What are some of the key takeaways from the ecosystem? How does the ecosystem feel? Because when we talk to customers, there are both sides. There are a lot of people who want to implement Kubernetes no matter whatsoever. And then there is a class of people or individuals who are like, why should I go for it? So definitely you have your own use cases to support Kubernetes or to avoid Kubernetes. Let's see what we have seen in the last couple of minutes. So scenarios where Kubernetes makes sense, right? What are the possible scenarios where you can go for Kubernetes kind of an approach? So definitely you have a microservices architecture and your applications are all containerized. You are all ready with container technology. You have a microservices architecture. You are kind of scaling, or basically I'll say heavy scaling, and you need some solution to manage these containers. So yeah, it makes sense to explore Kubernetes and implement that. You want to deploy applications at a large scale pretty fast. So yes, that's again, I'll say a good use case for Kubernetes kind of a tool. You have container related expertise within your organization. So when I say container related, it's more like people or team have knowledge and understanding about containers, in general Docker. There is like dedicated cloud or DevOps expertise within a team. So it makes sense for you to explore Kubernetes. You want to build a cloud agnostic architecture. So cloud agnostic architecture only with vanilla Kubernetes. So that's kind of disclaimer over there. Reason being, in case you are using one of the managed provider Kubernetes, right? One of their offerings. So again, you are kind of tied up with that particular vendor. In case you want to move away, you have to realign or re-architect your applications. So in case you are using a vanilla Kubernetes, you are having a cloud agnostic architecture. As we discussed in the benefits, right? It's kind of portable. You can take it to any other cloud vendor. Finally, if you're looking for a high performance computing without resource restrictions, so definitely Kubernetes is the way to go. It manages all your resources efficiently. There is a master, right? It's a more of a master worker node kind of a setup. So master will be taking care of all the things as and when defined and specified by you in the YAML files. So basically Kubernetes config files. So this is the part that we talked first, part one, when using Kubernetes makes sense. Next, let's talk about what we recap and when you can skip Kubernetes, right? When skipping Kubernetes makes sense. So you do not have a container-based microservices architecture. You're still implementing or exploring, or you're trying to get into a microservices mode. So that's not the right time to jump onto a Kubernetes kind of approach, right? So first break your monolith into a microservices architecture, containerize them, and then maybe start exploring Kubernetes approach. Secondly, you are an individual or a small organization running only few containers and little traffic to balance. So in the past slide we saw, right, when you are trying to scale heavily and fastly, then Kubernetes makes sense. This is just the opposite of it. You are a small individual having some private project or a small startup or organization, SMB, with only few containers to manage and a little traffic. So definitely a heavyweight Kubernetes doesn't make sense for you. You do not have in-house expertise, so definitely yes. Because in case you do not have in-house expertise and you still want to implement something like this, so we have already discussed Kubernetes is a complex tool and has a lot of learning curve over there. So that would be an extra overhead involved. Finally, you do not want to add complexity to your system. You want to keep it simple because Kubernetes comes along with its own baggage of complexity. So you want to keep your system simple. You want when I say simple, as in you can still manage your containers, but there are different technologies other than Kubernetes that you can try to evaluate, which are much more easier to manage as compared to a complex system like Kubernetes, right? So on that, I'll finally leave you with a note. And for me, the key takeaway for this session would be um, don't be a sheep, don't follow the herd, think for yourself, because ultimately it's your production environment, it's your organization, right? You understand your needs better, what kind of architecture you have, what kind of support within the team you have, what kind of expertise do you have, and what kind of expertise do you build in. Do I have that much of overhead of time and resources that I can spend to build that expertise? So based on all those use cases, there's no specific yes or a no for Kubernetes. It's mostly a case-by-case basis. So where do you stand depends on whether you should go with a Kubernetes kind of approach, or you can skip for now. Maybe you can come back sometime point of time in future and yeah, again reconsider Kubernetes or similar approaches, right? So I think with that, I'll kind of close it and open the floor for Q&As. But yeah, thank you for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Saurabh. Great talk. We've got some questions in the chat here. And to the audience, if you have more questions, please type them in the questions box now and we'll answer as many as we can live. So first question, why not go for Kubernetes at the start so that you don't have to migrate at a later stage, or making migration easier at a later stage?
Sure. So, I mean, that's an interesting question, but I mean, definitely I would like to have more details in terms of when you say, what do you mean by why can't I go for Kubernetes in start? So if I assume that you are like a startup or an individual who is trying to work on Kubernetes and want to not go for like in the later stage, as I said, right, do you have those kind of capabilities within your team? If you have that kind of bandwidth or expertise within the team, or you are okay with building that at this point of time when you are starting, because when I start as an individual or as a starter, my focus area would be building my product and releasing them into markets as soon as possible, as I said, right? And I would not like to prioritize more on the infrastructural setup. That would be my second priority. So based on your use case, if you think that you have individuals who can take care of setting up something as complex as Kubernetes and they can pick up the technology on the go, they already know this technology, it can be a good approach to implement like from the start. But I mean, honestly speaking, I haven't seen a lot of companies doing that initially, because there are certain phases prior to that. You need to understand container, you need to have DevOps kind of a setup, you need to have automation tool chains into place. If everything else in terms of requirement is met, you can start with Kubernetes.
Great. What are some alternatives to Kubernetes if we want high availability?
So I think as an alternative to Kubernetes, the popular ones are basically, I'll say Nomad, right? So Nomad is there, which is available, and I feel somewhere I have used not much of Nomad, but the kind of exposure that I have, that seems to be much more simple in terms of learning. The other option could be Docker Swarm, right? So definitely in the I'll say the run between Kubernetes and Docker Swarm was left far behind basically. But then that's again a use case that you can consider based on what kind of approach that you have. If you just have containers and you need some kind of a workload to manage them, you can consider Swarm or Nomad.
Great. There is some developer lock-in with some of the cloud providers' Kubernetes solutions. Is it realistic and feasible to find an agnostic cloud?
What I've seen in the community, honestly speaking, I do not see a agnostic cloud as such in terms of like a provider giving you the benefits of moving out at any point of time. When you choose a Kubernetes from one of the vendors, definitely comes with vendor lock-in, and they have their own terms and condition. And also when you will use a vendor-based or vendor-managed Kubernetes, right, you will build your architecture around that, and you will internally consume services from the vendor. So later point of time when you're trying to disassociate that architecture from vendor and move to maybe some other cloud provider or do it on your own, you have to kind of reinvent the wheel. You have to re-architect all your applications and everything. Not only the Kubernetes segment, but yeah, in terms of the entire area. So that kinds of become difficult. But in case you are doing a vanilla Kubernetes out of the box, you have capabilities within your team. You can go for like not a vendor-based solution, but a self-hosted Kubernetes on your own.
What are the benefits and the pros and cons of using a Kubernetes management platform as opposed to the native ones that come with your cloud provider?
Okay, so that's I'll say it's much more generic. I'll say in terms of self-hosted technology, be it a application or a cloud or a database versus a managed solution, right? So whatever benefits that you get in a managed solution are the same applicable to managed Kubernetes also. Some of them could be dedicated support. So as I said, right, You might build some kind of an expertise around Kubernetes, but in case things break into Kubernetes ecosystem, the team might not be like I'll say handy to face those challenges or issues. They need to do a lot of troubleshooting. You need to look into the right direction, and that might cost you in terms of your business revenue, right? Because the production is down or whatever is happening. In that case, a managed solution makes much more sense because out of the box you get dedicated support from the management. Secondly, as I said, it's not highly secure tool. So in case there is a security update, you have to constantly keep on updating it on yourself. You have to keep on a watch out, right? If there is a new security patch released for Kubernetes, or if there is a new version that is available, should we do it or should we not? But when you go with a managed vendor, these are things that are kind of managed by the vendor. Third, as I said, it's more of a master worker node setup. When you do a self-hosted Kubernetes, you have access to master, which is a good thing, right? You have access to master, but what also means is that you have to take care of the master. You have to manage it. So master manages your entire infrastructure, and you manage the master. If something happens to master, like there is etcd, etcd is basically like kind of your entire database setup. If that's somehow gets deleted or those kind of things, right? You have to keep a replica of it. You have to ensure that those kind of things in terms of stability of the master are always up and running. So that's on the self-hosted side. If you go to a managed version, master is mostly managed by the cloud providers. So they will ensure on your behalf that your master is never done. You do not, most of the cases what I've seen is they do not give you direct access to the master. You just have access to the worker nodes. You can deploy applications on top of that. So master, definitely you can be like tension free that it's kind of stable and everything is healthy on the master side. So those are certain things that comes as a part of managed Kubernetes offering from the cloud providers.
Thanks, Saurabh. One of our audience members mentioned that it's weird to hear about vendor lock-in from someone who is from DigitalOcean. What's your response to that? And one more note, they say they always consider that our managed Kubernetes offering is relatively free of vendor lock-in entanglements.
Sure. So, I mean, yes, we also have a managed offering of Kubernetes. We call this DOKS. So DigitalOcean Kubernetes as a service, right? So when we talk about what kind of vendor lock-in we have from DigitalOcean, so I said, right, see, we manage your master and you manage your resources in terms of worker nodes. That being said, there is no written agreement in terms of vendor lock-in, as in you have to stay on the platform for like this much of time, you have to spend this much of money. That's not a direct lock-in. The only thing is we follow a very simplistic model in terms of pay per use kind of thing. That's a thing across the globe, right, for the cloud providers. So in case you want to play around with our Kubernetes offering, and also like we have some kind of free trial offers going on. So if you lucky, you get some $100 of credit, you can log into the system, play around with Kubernetes. Whenever you want to leave, you can always feel free to leave, and you will be definitely charged till what time you have used the services, right, the resources. So it's mostly like you'll not be charged for the entire month, but maybe for the period of time that you have consumed those services. So as such, there's no direct lock-in, but as I said, once you start building on top of that, you will always keep in mind what I get on DigitalOcean as a platform, right? And you will try to use those services. Later point of time, maybe 1 year or 2 years down the lane, if you want to move to some other cloud provider, your infrastructure as well your applications might be tightly coupled with the kind of setup DigitalOcean has, which might make it a bit difficult for you to move up. So we do not force you to stay on the platform, but then yeah, slowly over a period of time, you start designing your application and your infrastructure in such a way to consume more services from that vendor, and that's how you get indirectly logged in. But definitely, we do not like have any kind of a commitment in terms of number of hours or number of revenue that you have to spend.
Thanks for that, Saurabh. What do you suggest is the best way to manage load-based scaling using Kubernetes?
So I'm honestly speaking not too sure in terms of like what do you mean by load-based scaling, because Kubernetes is a solution for load-based scaling, right? So what does that mean is when you start scaling in terms of whatever application or maybe an e-commerce site or a website that you have in terms of a business, you start seeing increase in traffic, increase in numbers, like you go from X to 2X and 3X, right? And that's where things start getting out of hand. And this is where like a system like Kubernetes comes into picture to help you manage these kind of resources in terms of scaling. So as I said, we have config files in Kubernetes where you can define the min and the max, and Kubernetes master, right? The master manages entire infrastructure, can automatically take care of these things. So whenever you have a peak of 2x or 3x, it will automatically scale your infrastructure. Suppose I have 10 machines normally, right? And when I have 2x traffic, I want them to be scaled to 12 machines. Not 12, from 10, I'll 20 machines maybe. So I've defined those numbers within my config files. Whenever there is a spike in the traffic and I reach like 2x, automatically the master will kind of start scaling my infrastructure from 10 to 20 machines. And as soon as that spike is down, right, it comes back to the normal traffic. It will again bring my scaling like from 20 to back to 10. So that's a kind of an inbuilt feature from Kubernetes itself. You do not have to do anything specifically to manage heavy workloads. You just need to like set up the right configuration within the files.
Great. Can you give a brief introduction on how Kubernetes users can manage application logs? What's the best mechanism to do so?
So on the logging side, what we have seen is that two most popular approaches, and that is applicable to Kubernetes ecosystem also, right? I think there's a slight variation now. So when you're talking about logging, I'm sure you must have heard of ELK, right? ELK, that we popularly call. So that's a combination of Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. Kibana being the dashboard where you can see the logs, and other are log aggregators that get the logs from your application infrastructure and show it on Kibana. So ELK has been most popular tool and is still applicable to Kubernetes-based ecosystem. But Kubernetes as a community has slightly replaced ELK to EFK. So instead of Logstash, now they kind of advocate using Fluentd, which is much more easy to manage kind of solution. So you have both ELK and EFK kind of approach for log management on Kubernetes.
Cool. Are there some solutions or platforms that you'd recommend to simplify Kubernetes?
That's an interesting question. Honestly speaking, the ecosystem is like kind of vast and diverse. A lot of new third-party solutions are available. I'm not sure if they really like make your life easy in terms of management of Kubernetes. See, Kubernetes, the whole use case is making your life simpler by managing containers. Now, Kubernetes becomes complex. You need a solution to manage that. I'm not aware of a tool or technology, but definitely, as I said, right, a lot of things are happening within our ecosystem right now. So maybe there could be a solution, but I'm not aware of like how to manage Kubernetes to make it easy.
Well, we do have an upcoming tech talk about DigitalOcean's Kubernetes solution, so perhaps that would be of interest to this audience member. Saurabh, do you want to give a quick intro to DOKS or?
Sure. So yes, DOKS is our own offering from DigitalOcean in terms of Kubernetes. So as I said, right, you get a free master. You do not have to pay for it. It's cost effective as compared to the services available from other cloud providers. When you match the kind of pricing that they have, we are kind of cost effective over there. You get free dedicated support on Kubernetes from us. Then in terms of I'll say scaling, we do have auto scaling facilities which are there. So one of the best and simplest platform to explore if you are looking for a Kubernetes kind of approach. So honestly speaking, I started when I mentioned right around 4 years back when Kubernetes was pretty new. I started with vanilla Kubernetes. So if you are aware of this, Kelsey Hightower, he mentioned Kubernetes the hard way, right? So I started with that. And for me, it was a pretty tough job because one, Kubernetes was relatively new, not that new as in like a couple of months, but maybe a year or so. The community was still maturing. It was not a mature community. And in case you have an issue, right, you were not able to get instant responses. So even Google was not of help. Stack Overflow was not helping. So I was always wishing for some kind of a managed Kubernetes solution from providers. And yeah, maybe 1 year down the lane, the providers started doing that. When I joined DigitalOcean, I explored their managed offering. I was like kind of stunned by the kind of simplicity. Because for me, Kubernetes has always been more of a nightmare to manage as a solution. But if you try Kubernetes from DigitalOcean, right, I'll say just a couple of clicks, maybe 4 or 5 clicks that you need to do in terms of what you want to choose, which region you want to spin up a cluster, and you're good to go. So 10 minutes down the lane, you have a Kubernetes cluster up and running within a DigitalOcean platform. You can start deploying and playing around. It's that simple.
Thanks for the quick overview. When using Kubernetes with high load, does it ever happen that you have to tune the syscontrol kernel parameters on the nodes and or the containers?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Samantha?
Sure. When using Kubernetes with high load, does it ever happen that you have to tune syscontrol kernel parameters on the nodes or containers?
So when you're working with high load system, right, there are options in Kubernetes to manage your resources also. You can define and limit your resources in terms of CPU or memory being consumed by pods. So basically inside worker nodes, what you have is a concept of pods. That's the smallest unit of Kubernetes. So using limit resources on pod level, you can try to manage heavy workloads. And out of the box, Kubernetes master definitely will take care of the workload, right? So in case I have 3 nodes running and the system feels that this is not sufficient for me to run a new workload. So once I do a new deployment, it will automatically spin up a new worker node and put the deployment on that. I mean, it has its own algorithm working at the backend, how it finds the best node as a fit. But then yeah, the workload will be taken care of. So you don't have to worry about the heavy workloads, heavy lifting over there. The master will do its job for you.
Even if we take a managed Kubernetes from a service from a cloud provider, how easy it is to migrate to other clouds?
Okay, so there's no specific answer to that, but I'll say the way you manage it. So I have seen a couple of customers for with whom it was like more of a nightmare, a lot of troubles in terms of migration. Reason being, they have not automated their process, and it was as simple as like a cakewalk for a couple of customers, both using the same vendor managed Kubernetes. So what was the difference? Difference was in the setup. In case, as I said, right, as a prerequisite, you are following the DevOps community. You have automation tool chains in place, tools like configuration management tools like Ansible or Terraform, which is quite popular, and you use those kind of scripts, playbooks to trigger your Kubernetes deployments. So it's mostly a matter of a few changes, right? You just change the provider name and some changes in the script, and you should be able to migrate your workloads from one provider to another. But in case you do not have those dedicated automation setups in place, then it might be a difficult task moving from the entire chunk of workload from one provider to another. So as I said, right, it basically depends on the kind of setup. The way you set it up, you have automation tools in place, they'll make your life easier.
Thank you, Saurabh. Do you believe that Kubernetes can be used in a real multi-cloud?
So I feel, I mean, that's more of an ideal scenario. So when you talk about multi-cloud environment, basically, are you proposing a solution like a vanilla Kubernetes that you are doing a self-hosting and then using workloads for other providers, or you are using multiple Kubernetes from different providers and then like spinning up a multi-cloud approach? Because honestly speaking, when you talk about multi-cloud, what basically means is you have different cloud provider, like more than 2, right? So 2 or 3 vendors that I have, they have their own services and I'm using their services for different reasons. So maybe because of geographic locations, or maybe because of workload segregation in terms of production on something, staging on another provider due to certain reasons. So if you have that kind of a setup and then you are trying to use a Kubernetes kind of an approach from each of the vendors, managing that might be a difficult task. So honestly speaking, I've seen a lot of people asking about these kind of setups, but a successful implementation, I mean, I haven't seen yet. People are trying to achieve that kind of setup where they have a multi-cloud setup and they use Kubernetes from different providers, or they have their own vanilla customized Kubernetes running on top of a multi-cloud setup.
Thank you. And this is our last question today. Sorry, we weren't able to answer all the questions that have come in, but we'll try to do our best to answer them on the Tech Talks pages in the coming weeks. So our last question is, Saurabh, how do you find out how much Kubernetes is going to cost me? Is there like a calculator somewhere? What can I do to find out which solution is the most cost effective for us?
I wish there was like a Kubernetes kind of a calculator to give you an exact or approximate costing of Kubernetes, like the workload involved. But unfortunately, no. But what you can do as an exercise is you can evaluate what kind of worker nodes are you going to configure, right, within the cloud or outside the cloud. You know the configuration and you know the pricing for these worker nodes. And then in terms of number of nodes, you always do an approximation. So I can assume that I might need 6 worker nodes. So I'll just keep it as like 8 to 10 on the higher side, just to manage that margin. So instead of like approximate 6, I'll take it as 10 worker nodes into what kind of nodes and what is the pricing. So as I said, right, I was mentioning about DOKS, the DigitalOcean Kubernetes Service. This is one of the beauty, like apart from the simplicity to create a Kubernetes cluster, the pricing is also pretty transparent. So I'll not say it will give you 100% idea of what would be the exact price, because you might be consuming certain other services. But at a high level, you will know what is the price for the cluster, because master, as I said, is free from us, right? You just have to pay for worker nodes, and worker nodes for us are nothing but virtual machines under the hood. We call them as droplets. So there are different families of droplets, and there's a pricing associated with each family. So as I said, what kind of machine you are using, which family you are using, you can find the cost for that into number of machines. That will be the size of my cluster, and that will give me an approximate size of my cost at the end of the month. Also depends upon what other services I'm consuming. Am I using some database services? I'm like consuming too much of bandwidth, because we do provide some free tier of bandwidth. If you overboard that, you will be charged, right? So if I'm like a heavy bandwidth consuming applications are running on my cluster, so apart from the cost of the cluster, there would be these extra charges to it. But yes, if you have some time, just try DigitalOcean Kubernetes, and when you're creating, then itself you'll get a very approximate idea of what could be the price.
Wonderful. Thank you, Saurabh, for sharing, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. So Saurabh, any parting thoughts or words of wisdom for our audience?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for taking out your time during these tough times and joining for this webinar. Um, just feel that you have some good takeaways at the end of the session. And on a final note, as I said, right, there is no yes or a no to a technology, be it Kubernetes or maybe any technology. It always depends upon kind of use cases. If you have very strong and supporting use cases and you have that kind of a setup within your organization, right? I have a team which can manage containers. I have the expertise to build around Kubernetes ecosystem, and I have a use case, I should go for it. But if these parameters are not met, Kubernetes might not be the best technology for you at this point. Maybe once you scale or once you build up that expertise or when you reach that level, you can start exploring Kubernetes. On that final note, I'll like to say goodbye to all of you.
Thanks, everyone. Tell us how we did and what topics you'd like to learn more about next. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye-bye.